I'm delighted today to be joined by the esteemed author and journalist, or retired journalist, I should say now, Mr. Paddy Barclay. How are you doing, Paddy?
Very well indeed, thanks. Lovely to see you. We're talking on a beautiful sunny day. A typical Mancunian day, but we're in London, in my house.
Yeah, the sun is shining, the strange thing in the sky, which is normally obscured by greyness.
Yep.
We're talking about Sir Matt Busby and Jimmy Murphy, both written books on those individuals.
Yeah.
The first thing I want to ask is what made you want to write a full biography about Sir Matt, considering how much has already been written?
Yeah, it's true. There have been very outstanding biographies in the past. I would, if you talk about Matt himself, A Strange Kind of Glory by Eamon Dunphy.
Yep.
Most people listening to this will have read that, or they should have, and if they haven't, they should.
Absolutely.
Eamon Dunphy, who'd been a youth player at Manchester United, for those who don't know him, now an inveterately controversial pundit on Irish TV and radio, but a fine writer too, and did a wonderful job on Matt. However, where a gap existed that I could fill, I felt, was that Eamon's story ends before Alex Ferguson begins.
Yeah.
And I think it is a ridiculous sort of omission, really, from the history of Manchester United. Most young people know Matt Busby. They don't know really, and they know he's a god.
Yeah.
But they don't really know much more than that. But they do know Alex Ferguson, Sir Alex Ferguson, and what I felt it was ridiculous in a way for us now to have only the Matt Busby story in isolation, without it being juxtaposed to the story of Sir Alex Ferguson, which was so completely interlinked. But it struck me very quickly that Alex Ferguson wouldn't, and I've written a book about him as well, so I know enough about him, a lot about him, and the thing is, he would never have dreamed of going to Manchester United but for Matt Busby's legacy. Never have thought about it. And when he came to Manchester United, who was his great support? Well, there were two, Sir Bobby Charlton, and to an extent Martin Edwards, who was close to Bobby Charlton on the board during the early trials and tribulation, and Sir Matt Busby. And I'd done an interview with Sir Alex about... I'm trying to think of the year. It was just before the first title, so it'd be 1992. And he told me then, and he knew that he was getting things right at Old Trafford, but he obviously nobody could have known how right he was getting it. But he knew that the tide was turned. They were battling Leeds for the last Football League First Division title, and they were eventually to win it in the First Premier League, as every Man United fan will know. And he talked very fulsomely about what a comfort it was to go into Old Trafford, and he rather graphically described it. He said, if I went into Old Trafford and I could smell the pipe smoke, I knew that Matt was upstairs, and he would go up and talk to him. So, and then also it came out in the first section of my book, the similarities between Sir Matt and Sir Alex, many of them probably learned by one from the other, are uncanny. You could almost write a book just about the similarities. So that was the reason that I felt it had to be done again, and that's what I endeavoured to do.
We spoke about that briefly before we started recording. You mentioned the similarities. That always interests me because I get the impression that there are Busby loyalists who would be aghast that there are similarities between them.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I don't mean personally, although they had different personalities. So Matt was almost, by modern standards, almost excessively restrained.
Yeah.
And some people said, that he almost verged on boring because he wouldn't give too much away in conversation. He would speak in bland banality. Not banality. Banality is going too strong, but in sort of bland phrases where you were yearning from a man of such wisdom for a little more insight. And funnily enough, even David Meek, the great veteran Manchester United journalist of the Manchester Evening News, who worked with them both. And when I asked him, which did you prefer as a man, Sir Alex or Sir Matt? And he's hesitated for so long that I had to stop the interview. Because although you would expect, people of a certain age would expect that, oh yes, as a man I preferred Sir Matt because he was kindly and avuncular, whereas Sir Alex could be a bit scary. What David said was that Sir Alex was better at letting you into his thoughts.
Yeah.
Of giving you, sometimes off the record information, but he would say, listen, David, this is what, don't print this, do print that, but this is what I'm trying to do. Whereas Matt would, always keep his cards a little bit close to his chest, which I thought was interesting. But we're veering off the question. You're saying that some people might say aghast because Sir Alex is perceived as a scary character and Matt as a lovable uncle, but no, there were huge similarities in terms of the way they worked. If you look at the basic footballing principles, one, footballing, entertainment, the working man or woman paying whether it's two and sixpence in Matt's early days or the rather higher admission charges of the Premier League era, both fervently believed that the public had to go away saying, I saw Manchester United today. And for Manchester United to be a synonym for excitement, entertainment. I think when Ferguson at his peak often used to talk about, these being manager of Manchester United is not good for you, because they take you on a roller coaster all the time. But I think he was rather proud of that. He wasn't complaining. That kind of excitement, that swashbuckling Cavalier style, was very much what Matt made of Manchester United. And Ferguson didn't ever really hide that his job was to uphold the standards set by Matt Busby. Not only in swashbuckling football, control. Mm-hmm. Matt was a control freak, if you like.
Yeah.
And so was Alex Ferguson. And neither, if they were honest, would really argue with that. And in fact, I think at one stage, can you remember when Wayne Rooney was toying with the idea of leaving United?
Yep.
And Ferguson, in his extraordinarily upfront explanation to the press and obviously the public, said something about the manager must be the most important man at this club. This was the tradition laid by. So there's another thing. Control wingers. I mean, you think of, close your eyes, you think of an Alex Ferguson side, and they're attacking on a broad front. You have Beckham on one side, you have Giggs on the other, you have Kanchelskis on one side, you have Lee Sharp on the other. All that broad attacking sweep. Again, for that you can read Jimmy Delaney and Charlie Mitten, all the way through to 1968, George Best and the hero of the night, Johnny Aston. It had to be done with wingers, and Sir Alex followed that scrupulously. If I can we could talk all day about the similarities, but I'll give you just one more: squad rotation. Matt virtually invented that to cope with European football, where Manchester United were the first. Okay, they didn't. They didn't in the Busby Babes era. They didn't win it, but they never failed to reach the semi-finals. They were always in it, and to cope with the fixture congestion, Sir Matt sometimes once he rested 9 players.
Yeah,
for a match on the Monday when there was a European match on the Wednesday.
The classic case, sorry to interrupt, but before Arsenal, for the Arsenal game before Red Star, there was 4 or 5 players that played for the reserves that ended up travelling.
Oh yeah, they would.
David
Pegg, unfortunately, yeah.
Whelan as well.
Cost him his life. Billy Whelan, ditto. Sensational players who couldn't get into the team because of Albert Scanlon keeping Pegg out. Some people thought different type of players, but frankly, both of them could have gone in the England team at any time.
Yeah.
You mentioned Billy Whelan. Well, he was the most half a yard of pace, and he'd been an all-time great.
Yeah.
Even then, he wasn't far off being an all-time great. In fact, some people would say he was, and yet, he couldn't get in the team because a kid called Bobby Charlton had emerged. What can you do? But that was he. To be fair, he could. At a time when most managers managed with 14 to 15 players, he wanted 22.
Yeah.
Because he wanted to be able, if European demands meant, he wanted to be able to change his entire team and still win. Apart from anything else, if you didn't win those games, you could have the league on your back, complaining about a weakened side. He didn't want any side to be weakened, by changes. And Sir Alex, I would say, was the master of squad rotation in the age of squad rotation. I don't think anybody ever did it better. You never really heard of Manchester United players complaining, because they might have complained privately because they'd been left out of certain matches or rested. They often, particularly after they retired, they would talk about how Alex Ferguson would say to them, "Oh, in 3 weeks' time, I'm going to need you. So don't worry if you're going to be rested out of the..." And Matt was very much that kind of collegiate manager. But he was way ahead of his time. But in other things, Sir Alex just basically... He rebuilt, like St Paul's Cathedral being damaged in the war. You wouldn't rebuild it as a Nissen hut. You'd rebuild it as St Paul's magnificent cathedral, and that was Sir Alex's great achievement. It was, I think, Sandy Busby, Matt's son, once said that my father was the creation and Sir Alex was the resurrection.
Yeah,
it's a good way of putting it.
Perfect way of putting it.
But we haven't mentioned Jimmy Murphy. How can we go? I've gone all this time without talking about Jimmy Murphy.
Exactly, but I mean, we could, and I'd love to do it. Speak at a complete hour or two talking about Busby and Ferguson, because the comparisons are compelling. But like I said, we must talk about Jimmy Murphy. When I was writing the biography for Jimmy, I knew that when the time came to release it, there would be people asking, should there be a statue? Should there be a stand named after him? All about getting him more recognition, all that sort of thing. It usually ties in with the question about whether or not the club did enough to acknowledge him, or have done enough.
Yes.
Now, in researching the book, I saw a few items of correspondence about Jimmy, responses to members of the public asking for these things, letters which were kept by the Murphy family. And it came clear to me that, far from downplaying him, I thought that the club actually treated Jimmy as a special case. The correspondence would always be passed to and handled by people who knew him, rather than the stock response that people would get.
Yes.
And it would tend to be, knowing Jimmy as we did, we think he'd be embarrassed by the idea of the statue.
Yes.
I thought it would be really difficult to disagree with that as I was writing, because I thought, this is the idea I'm coming along with. So I prepared my own answers to the situation if ever I was asked. I thought I was bound to do a little bit of promotion for the book, so my stock response, or the one that I prepared, was to say that I felt that the club had dealt with it sensitively and appropriately as well. But on the eve of the release of the book, I did a thing for BBC Radio, and the first caller in said there needs to be a statue of Jimmy on the forecourt at Old Trafford, so that younger generations will ask who it is, and then they'll consequently be told.
Yeah.
And do you know what? We're close to a generation of supporters. Perhaps we're in it now, where soon it's going to be ancient history as far as they're concerned. So
I agree with you.
It's almost just even the name the Busby Babes would give someone cause to inquire further, and naturally they'll go to Sir Matt. But do you feel as if there is a need for people to be educated or almost reintroduced about what Sir Matt did and Jimmy?
Yes, but I think the two go together. What I would like to say, and I'd be interested in your opinion of this. I would say that, and this was in earlier times when I was researching the life of Sir Alex Ferguson, I had to decide, was he a great football manager, or was he a genius? And I came down on the side that he was a kind of a genius, but that the ultimate genius of football management had been Brian Clough. Not the best, didn't last the pace as long as, who has lasted the pace as long as Sir Alex Ferguson did, but pure genius, Brian Clough was, in my opinion. And then I thought, Brian Clough alone was a good football manager, but not a genius. Brian Clough and Peter Taylor together were pure genius. Now, I don't think there is any pair in football management who could be considered as alike, apart from those two, than Murphy and Busby. Bear in mind that Busby never had another number two. Alex Ferguson, Brian Kidd, Jimmy Ryan, Archie Knox, Steve McLaren, Carlos Queiroz,
Mike Phelan at the end.
Mike Phelan. Did I mention Jimmy Ryan? Yeah. So, a lot. And it's almost as if he believed, Queiroz and McLaren left for better jobs, but it was almost as if he felt, that thing needed replenishing now and again. You have new ideas for the players to hear. But Murphy did that all through. Busby's career, was always there at his side, apart from the first few months, but while Jimmy was still completing his war service and Matt had finished. But all of the time, Jimmy was there. With even talk when Matt stepped down of Jimmy being an ideal, but Jimmy was the same age as Matt, so more or less. So he was there all the time, and he wasn't just there with the first team. He was there with the first team, helping with the reserves, helping with the youths, scouting. Yeah. So the entire Matt Busby creation, I would say, is and I hope, you did justice to it, but I hope that in mind that I did as well. I hope there was. It troubles me slightly that, especially after reading yours, whether I quite did that. I must say, can I just say, Wayne, that I think your fairness, you must have been tempted. There's always an impulse to crank up the drama. Yeah. And you must have been very conscious that your audience might have liked your book, almost to say Matt was unfair to Jimmy, or they didn't support him enough, because Matt, even after he stepped down, I know and you know that he was Manchester United. He would tell the chairman what to do. That influence diminished, but yes, he could have done. But I thought you were scrupulously fair to Matt. You if you ever were tempted to stick in the knife, you never picked it up. And I must say that I think that was one of the best things of a brilliant book, was that it didn't fall into the cliche of, I'll find a bit of scandal here. Because make no mistake, the audience wouldn't have minded it. Because a lot of people have thrown accusations out. And I can see why. Yeah. I can see that Matt didn't do everything he could.
Thank you. But the thing is as well, because I'm a United fan, so I'm as loyal to the idea of Busby being as brilliant as anyone. Yeah. And like I said, there's a massive temptation when you're writing someone else's life story, especially someone who's closely linked to Matt, to... In that scenario, you're almost giving Jimmy all the praise in some respects, and so you have to sort of scale it back a little bit, and sort of like, when you're appropriate. Well,
I could sense that you did that, and it was good. But I was glad when I found out, as you did, when Matt said the best signing I ever made was Jimmy Murphy. Yeah. That is undoubtedly, there's no question about that. That's true, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, perhaps he knew that with George Best, you don't coach him. You just set him free. Give him a red shirt and stand back and applaud. With Duncan Edwards, I think he did put in a bit of work, but they were genius. They were great. I mean, two of the best youngsters that ever came out of the British Isles, those two. But a lot of the time he was improving Bobby Charlton. Now, Bobby Charlton obviously was a huge talent, but what turns a huge talent into a world-class player, a World Cup winner, a European Ballon d'Or winner, and all that? Well, he said Jimmy Murphy's coaching.
Yeah. I felt, I never got to the end of quite what this is, but I think there was a disagreement somewhere along the time with Sir Bobby and Sir Matt, which led to that infamous, really, of Sir Bobby coming out and saying that. Yeah, because I think Sir Matt, he was affronted by that, wasn't he?
Yes.
I never found out why, but that's not to say that the statement wasn't fair, but it was, I guess, the way in which it was delivered.
Yeah, it was in a public speech.
Yeah.
But now, if when you say nobody's done more for me than, or, I owe to Jimmy Murphy, Harry Gregg did tell me that it's wonderful that Harry was in such great shape and to help about that, because one thing Harry doesn't deal in banalities, that's for sure. Yes, he was there when that speech was made, and he said he could remember looking straight at Matt and sensing Matt's discomfiture. Yeah, that's true. I think Matt he did get slightly irritated once when somebody talked about United's football being wonderfully off the cuff. And he said, this was the Busby Babes. He says, well, if anybody thinks that this is off the cuff, they don't know anything about football, and they certainly haven't attended our training sessions where we work on shape and pattern of play. I think a little bit like, dare I say it, and Wayne, you're not to shout at me here, a little bit like Pep Guardiola, I don't coach tackling, I coach I coach attacking play, and but Matt did have a desire for tackling, but he preferred to go to people who didn't need too much coaching, like Nobby Stiles and Paddy Crerand, and gently tell them that they had license to destroy.
And whereas Jimmy would be leading by example.
Jimmy would be saying, as he went, who was it he said it to? He told, I think he told Bobby Noble, who was going to be a great player, a Busby Babe. I saw him once. What a phenomenal player he was, fullback. But unfortunately succumbed to injury. And Jimmy told Bobby Noble, they can't run without ankles. And I don't think, to be fair, I don't think Bobby Noble would have needed that lesson. I think he was a bit of a fiery character to begin with, but a phenomenal player.
To go back to the start of Sir Matt being hired at United, he was hired by Walter Crickmer, James Gibson, and Louis Rocker.
Yes.
Now, they wanted a team who would entertain the working class folk of Manchester, and also a team comprised of locally developed players.
That's right.
Now, I've never been able to tell if this homegrown philosophy was done with the deliberate idea of creating a bond between the players and spectators, or whether it was done with the idea of having a money-making factory in there.
Well, probably both. I mean, Gibson was a businessman, but he was also a patriot. He'd lived in the Old Trafford area at the time when United moved there. Yeah. So, he believed in localism, and it's not wholly unheard of in football. The Barcelona like to have a sprinkling of Catalans if they can. Athletic Bilbao like to have have insisted on Basques. And I think there was a bit of that it's an old-fashioned idea, but a noble one, I think. It was really to do with creating the bond between the spectators and the team, and also a bond within the team.
Yeah,
I mean, even if you go to the class of '92, if you Beckham was from London, but he'd been coming up to Manchester school holidays since he was 11, something like 12.
Yeah.
So he knew Gary Neville, and he knew Nicky Butt and Paul Scholes, and they were Keith Gillespie, Ben Thornley, Robbie Savage, dare I say it, in that outstanding youth team. So, it is the ideal in football, and I think it always is. You can't do it now, but most people can't do it. But it is the ideal for kids to grow up together. And Gibson was a visionary at that in that way. Rocca was a visionary in the sense that he believes in the youth policy and youth development just as much. Most of the scouting he enjoyed was with the school teachers in the pitches of Manchester and the surrounding area. Yes, he'd go to Ireland and listen to the Billy Behan, the coach, the scout out there, telling him how good Johnny Carey was, and of course he signed him in the twinkling of an eye. But I think the coaching that was close to his heart was the stuff that was close to his home, in Prestwich, and that was so he shared very much. The three of them, Crickmore, Gibson, and Rocca, shared the dream of a Manchester team made of Manchester players. No mention of Manchester City in that equation.
No, and obviously they hired Samat, and Samat went and hired.
Yeah, well, his idea was that because he'd been, as you'll know, before the war as a player, he'd been captain of Liverpool and the manager of Liverpool, man who he greatly admired, George Kay, a Mancunian actually. Yeah. Was very much into youth policies. He'd done that at Southampton, where he discovered a young Ted Drake, who went on to become a great centre forward with Arsenal. So, he was into youth policy, and that will definitely rubbed off on Matt. And he also believes in home production. He'd learned as a player at Manchester City himself that the young players need to be nurtured and they need to feel part of the family, which apparently there was a huge dichotomy between the first team and the kids at City. And he said, never. If I'm ever in charge of a club, it's not going to be like that. So, it all just fell into place.
When Samat took control, like you said, in those days he did something which was unheard of, which was he demanded complete control of everything that he was doing in terms of controlling training, picking the team, and also transfers as well. Yeah. He hired Jimmy, as we said, we saw out in.
Well, that was fundamental.
Yeah.
Out in Bari, during the war, and Matt was part of a touring team of star players who were attached to the army at Aldershot. And he was out there. I think there wasn't much war left, but Jimmy was coaching soldiers, and Matt was transfixed by the way he would put the message over. Now, in a way, you see, this is genius, isn't it? To know that man, he made him a firm offer of the job.
Yeah.
He didn't sort of say, "Listen, give me your number and I'll keep in touch." It was when I get I think I'm not sure if he'd been offered United at that stage, but when I get a job, you will be my number two.
No, he was
already with...
Because he said there's a job waiting for you in Manchester. Which is,
right. That's right, because it was Louis Rocca wrote several months in advance, you're right. In the midwinter, that's true. And, he said, there's a job, and you're going to be my assistant. And it's fair to say he was,
yeah. There's... we'll talk a little bit about the blurred lines between exactly what they did. Jimmy was hired as a youth team coach, but the idea was that he would look after everything up until first team level.
Yeah.
So far as I understand it...
that quickly went out the window.
Yeah. Samat was used as something of a carrot in those days for the young players to get them in. He was treated as a god, and that never stopped, really. But in terms of... say Duncan Edwards, for example. Normally United wouldn't have had a problem convincing a young player, but when they did, they would wheel out Samat because he was the golden carrot, so to speak. Now, this is my understanding of it. Sir Matt would occasionally cast an eye over youth training.
Yes.
But by occasionally, I mean it was rare enough that the young players would up their energy and effort levels when they noticed it was there.
That was what how he was used, yeah.
And really would be when Jimmy would tell Sir Matt that a player was ready for the first team, then he'd go along and watch them. In terms of trying to rightly appropriate the praise for Jimmy, I've been careful, like we said earlier, not to do Busby, to do him a disservice. But do you think that in terms of the youth policy and everything, like what I've said and what I've put across in the book, do you think that Busby was more hands-on than the portrayal has been painted?
No, that is a good question. I do think it was like everything else. They were an indivisible team. It goes back to what we talked earlier before about the genius was the two of them together.
Yeah.
We don't know because Matt never managed without him.
Yeah.
And apart from with the Scotland team, two matches, but we don't know. But I think that Jimmy was the technique. Jimmy was the technique, and Matt was the inspiration.
Yeah.
But I don't think Matt could have done it without Jimmy. I really don't.
And the same the other way around.
Jimmy would have exploded without Matt's restraining influence. Many years later, there was not that many years later, there was a similar situation at Manchester City with Joe Mercer and Malcolm Allison. As a team, they were fantastic. They were complementary in the same way as the other great duos.
Yeah.
But when they were split up, in other words, when Joe Mercer was deemed surplus to requirements, Malcolm Allison just exploded. His ideas, he ate himself. It just... And I think that Jimmy, although Jimmy was an infinitely more modest person than Malcolm Allison, although they were both great coaches. I mean, Malcolm Allison was a great coach, no question about it. Although he was an infinitely more modest man, and I think he might just have, needed that restraining hand on the arm that Matt would provide. But fortunately for Manchester United, it was never tested. Although, I mean, you as a student of Murphy's, and if I may say so, a brilliant one, would have looked at his success with Wales, 1958, when he was on his own. No necessity for Matt, but a couple of great players, Cliff Jones, John Charles, maybe more. Ivor Holchurch, at least three very good players. In fact, he should have won the World Cup with that lot.
Mel Charles as well, yeah.
Mel Charles as well, yeah. But, seriously, he did well there. And he was much coveted by other clubs. Arsenal was one. You'll be able to tell me the others. But, I mean, there was a lot of interest in Murphy, of people saying, we are going to buy the Magic. But because of his loyalty, which you do point out very well in the book, is almost unheard of now, loyalty. He stayed, and so we'll never know. But I think he would have been a good manager. And I think Matt would have been a good manager on his own, in the same way as Clough was a good manager, but not great. No, I think the two together, you just can't separate them.
There's a slight hint of that. I'm not sure if it's in my notes, but I'll talk about it now anyway. That the Burnley game after the crash, where Bob Lord had made disparaging comments, and
that's right.
And Jimmy, from all accounts, it was good for Jimmy at the time because it served as fuel. But I think the general attitude was that in that particular instance, it was good because of the unique environment it was in. But that was exactly the kind of thing that Jimmy would have hated otherwise, that kind of politic and everything like that.
Yes, he would have. He would. I mean, he was a football man, essentially, wasn't he? I mean, he was... he never... aspired to Matt's statesman-like side or anything like that. And basically, he wanted to be coaching, or with his family, or in the Throstle's Nest while he reigned.
Yeah.
And not necessarily in that order.
Oh, maybe so. But the people have a tendency to romanticize. I mean, with Jimmy, it's easy because he was the coach and he was so hands-on. Whereas Busby, as you said earlier, he's quite right. He was a diplomat, but he also did. He was managing all that. The political side of being a manager of Manchester United, which was also at the time, which I don't talk about in the book, but I don't think it was really necessary. But obviously pioneering, trying to get United into Europe and making them a global name.
Yes.
All these things that now, if you consider a United manager, and why Mourinho's probably the right fit, whereas Van Gaal and Moyes weren't, is entirely that side of Busby's character. You know, the need to be a global profile.
That's a good point. That he was the sort of glove and the hand of Manchester United fitted snugly into it.
Yeah.
I think that's absolutely true. I mean, I still, when I think of Manchester United, I think of, well, I've got a painting in my. Did you see it on the way in? And it was given to me by I'm not a Manchester United fan. I'm a Dundee fan, but I lived in Manchester for a long time, and I've got a real feeling for both Manchester United and Manchester City, dare I say it. And anyway, I was given, when a friend of mine found out that I was writing a book about Matt, he got an artist friend of his to do a picture, and it shows the back of the scoreboard end stand circa 1960-ish, something like that, maybe a bit later. With the souvenir shop, no mega store in those days. Was it a Red Devils souvenir shop? It was called something like that, which later became Matt's pension in reality, and a picture of Matt sort of, appearing to walk across the forecourt there, and. Do you know, it matters, as I say, even though I'm not a Man United fan, it matters so much to me because I still think of Manchester United as Matt Busby. Yeah. I really do. I just think he summed up the class to which the club aspires, a class which the club showed, in my opinion, when Matt died. The first match after Matt died, which was against Everton, everybody who was there remembers it because it was done with such consummate taste and style. And so that, that his regard for glamour or the glamorous side of football, taking risks, youth, just everything that he believed in seems to me to be to sum up Manchester United, and I still say that Sir Alex Ferguson's towering achievement was to rebuild it faithfully and magnificently. Yeah. And whereas now I yield to no one in my admiration for the first of the great managers, Herbert Chapman, who I think I know, but he never said so, but I know Matt took a lot from Herbert Chapman, and then came, if we're talking about Arsenal, then came Bertie Mee, George Graham, pragmatists, all three, and along came Arsene Wenger and ripped it all up, and starts to create a sort of mini Barcelona in North London. Whereas Alex Ferguson didn't do that. He didn't say, "Look, that's all the past." He embraced the past, and to me that. Maybe I'm a silly sentimentalist, this silly old fool, but to me that was his greatest, of all his achievements, that was the greatest, to do it so faithfully.
I'm a huge Doherty loyalist. I've been lucky enough to, work with him a few times, written a few books on that era, and I've got big fondness for that team, the 77 side, which they said, could have gone on to do great things.
That was Manchester United football.
Yeah.
The Doherty team.
But the Atkinson era, and don't get me wrong, I grew up in that era. That's my first United side, but it almost seemed like a cheap knockoff. in the respects that
that's brutal.
Yeah, but you'll see where I'm coming from with this.
I do.
Harry Gregg, he's fond of calling United the Hollywood of football.
Yeah.
But I always get this as a different thing because his fondness for United is now, if you ever speak, well, obviously you have done that.
Yeah, for the book.
Harry Gregg's fondness for United now appears to me to be all the family connection of it and everything that Jimmy represented.
Yes.
But he was attracted to it for everything that Matt represented.
Absolutely. That's why he came in. And bear in mind that he was probably, when Harry came, although he came from a relatively modest club, Doncaster Rovers, I think, managed by Peter Doherty, his international manager with Northern Ireland. And, although he came from a relatively unfashionable club, he was probably one of the most highly rated keepers in the world at that time, because of the 58 World Cup where he was voted best keeper of the World Cup. But he said, he did actually say, and I think he said on previous occasions that he didn't even know what the money was. He just wanted to sign for Matt Busby.
Yeah.
Although, like everybody else, he quickly realised that there were two in this relationship.
In 52, Busby boasted that he had a team worth 200 grand waiting to come through the ranks. Yeah. Now, the transfer record at that time, for people listening who won't be aware, was around £35,000 for Jackie Sewell, which puts that boast into perspective. I mean, it was so innovative an idea that even if they were confident, they couldn't have known just how well it was going to succeed or how it would happen. But even in the first team, after they'd gone through the Murphy School of Hard Knocks, they weren't the finished article. So you've got Jimmy's polishing techniques, which would be, for example, taking players onto the Old Trafford pitch or on the back of the stadium, making them hit crossfield passes or learn with both feet and everything like that, with Bobby Charlton, the famous example. If he thought training sessions weren't competitive enough, he'd join in and kick the players. Yeah. What sort of things did Matt do once those players had graduated to the first team? What would he do to help refine the raw talents that he was fielding?
Mainly match management rather than coaching in the way you describe. Can I just tell you one other one? John Doherty, who would have been a very good player, but for terrible luck with knee injuries, very good technical player. And he'd been playing for the youth team. It might have been the reserves, and they'd won something like 11-1 at Blackpool. Who in Blackpool were no mugs. And but Murphy had seen something he didn't like. So he called, after the first training session on the Monday, after this 11-1 win, he called John Doherty over, and he said, he just changed and he was going away. He says, get stripped again. I want to show you something. And so Doherty got stripped again, went out alone onto the pitch with a ball and Jimmy Murphy. Jimmy Murphy puts the ball on the centre spot and then he says, right, whack it out to the touchline. Yeah. He whacks it out to the touchline. And he says, right, now go and get it and bring it back. He brings it back. He says, now whack it out to the touchline again. He made him do this about 5 times. And there was a journalist, George Follows, died at Munich, sadly, was watching this. And afterwards he said, Jimmy, what was all that about with Doherty? And he said, well, in that game at Blackpool, he played a crossfield ball when he should have just given it to the nearest man and gone for the return. I don't think he'd be doing it again. Yeah.
I love that about him because it was
tough love, eh?
And also, it's the simple things like just mentality like that. Don't be so wasteful. Do you know?
Yeah, that's it. That's it. He didn't like the ball being risked.
Exactly, and people would think that because of what Busby Murphy were doing around the time it started to blossom, it was like this idea that it was built on genius. Yeah. And maybe the visionary side of it was, but in essence, it was so simple, wasn't it? Yeah, things like that.
That's right.
Busby also made a remark about how he could sit in his office for 10 years and watch the success flow. Yeah. People talk about the lost potential, and that's obviously true. But in that statement, sometimes when they say lost potential, I don't think people appreciate how good a side was. They just say, well, they could have been someone, but at that time, October 56, they were being heralded as the best team in the world.
Yeah.
They lost to Real Madrid later that season, which was a learning curve.
Yeah.
I tried to liken that in modern terms to when United's fledgling side lost to Juventus, that great Juventus side in the 90s. It was kind of that educational process for them.
Yep.
So there was every expectation that United might defeat Real Madrid in 1958.
Yes.
It's not romanticism then to say that if Real Madrid were one of the two best sides in the world at that time, United were the other.
No. You might get an argument because the Red Star would be one team who would have said before the United game, this is a 50-50 game. United proved better than them over two legs. There were teams who had... But I think it is fair to say. I don't think... I did study this. I studied the notion that when Real Madrid started limping, Manchester United would be would be the lions catching the last gazelle, and everything points to that being true. Now, would United have caught in the end? Real Madrid bowed out in 60-61 season after five in a row. Would United have caught them before they did the five in a row? My guess would be yes.
Yeah.
I think they might just have caught them. Because that team that won 7-3 in 1960 against Eintracht Frankfurt in Glasgow was an old team.
Yeah.
Very old team. And, mind you, it wasn't bad. But it's possible that United would have caught them before then.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's too much doubt. The only slight doubt in my mind is that United won the English League in 1956.
Yeah.
They won it in 1957. Both times by near record margins. And they were young. They wouldn't have won it in 58.
You don't think so?
No. They were 8 old points behind Wolves.
Yeah.
And the season was over halfway through. And Wolves never faltered.
Yeah.
Now, even if United had beaten Wolves, I mean, we can talk about this at 60 years distance, because at the time it would have been sick, because who cares when all these boys have died, whether they'd have won the league or not. But I still think Wolves would have won that league.
Yeah.
And that's the only thing that makes me wonder. That team had 2 great seasons, but was there something malfunctioning in that season? That maybe not, because they had a bad start to the season in 57-8.
Yeah,
but then run into storming form. The 5-4 win at Arsenal.
Yeah,
the brilliant 3-3 draw in Belgrade. And I think they'd had a 7-2 home win over Wolves. Right?
Yeah, it was a really big win.
I know that they were beating Bolton, the team who always gave them trouble. But they were, so they were storming into form. You wouldn't bet either way. But my feeling was that they'd have struggled to overtake Wolves that season. Wolves were so good. So that's the only doubt. But the age structure of the team, the fact that if anybody lost form, you could put in, Albert Scanlon lost form. He was in sensational form at the time of the crash.
Yeah.
And he was keeping out one of the best wingers in Britain, possibly in Europe, David Pegg. So it was, the strength and depth was just formidable. There was the guy who died at Munich, who hardly ever got a game, Jeff Bent. He was one of the best fullbacks in Britain.
Yeah.
But he never got a game because he was Roger Byrne.
Yeah.
So the strength in depth, I'm sure, would have carried on, and that there would have been no need for the massive rebuilding traumatic rebuilding that took place over the decade to 68.
Particularly relevant because at that time, I mean, you could almost liken it to, there's almost a direct comparison with 40 years later when we had the fledgling side. And Ferguson took that and made them into a super club.
Yeah.
I mean, the global power of sort of Beckham and Giggs and everything like that.
That's right.
At that time, it's one of the lesser-known strands of the story. And again, I didn't touch on it in my book, but it's something that you've talked about. Busby's ideas at the time were about increasing the capacity of Old Trafford to 100,000 so that they could financially compete in Europe as well.
Yep, that was the way to do it because if you look at the crowds in Europe, you've got FA Cup crowds were bigger than league crowds in those days, but European crowds were even bigger than FA Cup crowds, if that was possible. They would just pack the ground. Now, even if, given that United seemed incapable of not at least getting to the last four, that would be 100,000 crowds, more or less guaranteed. Now, with players on fixed wages, that was providing an awful lot of money, which could then be given to the players for bonuses. Everybody would have gone to Manchester United. Because don't forget that Matt Busby never had the financial clout that Alex Ferguson had. That's why comparison of their figures is a little bit misleading. That the football's finances were run on an egalitarian basis, and so Manchester United had to give half their money to the visiting clubs.
Yeah,
and of course they'd benefit the other way around, but it was a different economy. But they were building big, and Alex Ferguson always had that idea of 100,000 stadium. He felt that when he was at Aberdeen, he said, "I'm only going to leave Aberdeen." He told his chairman, "I'm only going to leave for one of two clubs, Barcelona or Manchester United." That's how big Manchester United were, because at that time Barcelona had the biggest ground in the world.
Yeah. So to touch on a sad time in the club's history, obviously it's an anniversary year, the Munich disaster.
Yeah.
There were two statements in two conversations that came just before and just after the Munich air disaster. Two statements made by Sir Matt, which to me really define so much about United's history, or have such an indelible mark on it. So the first was when he stressed to Jimmy Murphy that he must travel with the Wales team to oversee the second leg World Cup qualifier against Israel.
Yep.
He said, if anything went wrong, you'd never forgive yourself.
That's right.
And then that was effectively one of the last things said between them before the disaster. Yeah. And then the first thing that Sir Matt said to him after it was keep the flag flying, which, two sentences, which, I don't want to gloss over the disaster or downplay significance. And the reason I'm not going to talk about it so much in this podcast is because there's obviously been some wonderful evocative things written. And then this year...
Yeah.
I'm going to assume some knowledge on behalf of the listener and say I don't need to recap the tragic events where all those lives were lost. But two sentences like that, they go down in folklore, don't they?
Yeah, they do. And it's difficult to think now. Try to convey the scale of the tragedy, but it was a national disaster. In 1953 had been the coronation, a very happy year, the scaling of Everest, I think, in the coronation. This was the sort of the obverse of that. This took the nation as down as the coronation had sent it up, almost in a way. But it was particularly traumatic for the city of Manchester, which pulled together very much so. It was something from which to try and... Probably the best way of showing what could have happened to Manchester United is to look at the Superga disaster in Turin, a couple of years after the end of the Second World War, when the Torino team that had been, I think, 4 or 5 times in a row champions of Italy, was completely wiped out by an air crash on the way back from a friendly testimonial match in Portugal. Now, that was in 1940, let's say 1948. It was 47 or 48, I can't remember. But in the decades, half a century since, more than half a century since, Torino have won 1 Scudetto. Mm. They were, Juventus were very much second best in the city of Turin. Juventus became the first team in the city of Turin and have remained so, virtually unbroken, for all those decades since. Because of Busby and Murphy. Look at Manchester United. Yeah. Has Manchester United failed to recover? You wouldn't blame them if they did, if they had, but they didn't. Yeah. And that's down to the stewardship of those 2 men.
It's one of the
others, but mainly those 2.
Yeah, absolutely. I think people underestimate that as well. I mean, not in a flippant way, but just because it's a story fabled. Because it's a fabled... Exactly, it's a fabled story. It's part of what we grew up with, so you don't question it, you don't analyse it. But if you analyse it, it becomes quite... I found when researching it, and I'm sure you did, that it becomes more awesome the more you look at it. Yeah, absolutely.
And wonder what might have happened.
One of the things I really wanted to ask you after you kindly agreed to do this was that second statement made by Sir Matt. Now, I may be over-analysing, I may be well guilty of that, but I feel those words where he said, keep the flag flying.
We're like, let's fight them on, we're going to fight them on the beaches. It was almost this, some people, men, probably a bit overblown to compare it, as they call it Churchillian, but it was somehow a great man finds the right phrase at the right time.
Exactly. I mean, not only that, I mean, on the one hand, I'm not certain that Jimmy Murphy would have found the resolve or motivation to continue had Matt not said that to him.
Yeah.
And then there's another part of me that also thinks that, obviously Matt asked him and then he had to keep good on his word. But the other thing is, I can't help but feel that if Matt had known the extent of the devastation, he wouldn't have asked. So I wanted to know
your interpretation. Might not have found such a perky phrase, that's for sure.
No. But do you think, obviously Matt was in and out of consciousness, he was close to death.
I think maybe he also knew what Jimmy would want to hear. He knew that Jimmy was, of course Jimmy was a great man, but he also had that faithful terrier mentality.
Yeah.
He did. He was probably, you'd be the expert about whether he was loyal to a fault, but he was fiercely loyal.
Yeah.
And so I think he knew that Jimmy would have wanted that. But Matt, at that stage, that early stage, had yet to suffer, and it was perhaps just as well for the resurrection of Manchester United. Okay, nothing could bring Duncan Edwards back, nothing could bring Roger Byrne and the rest back, but the resurrection of the club did help people, including the families, to cope with it, I think, some of the families. And so Matt, to that extent, knew. Now, whether Matt had that conversation taken place a week or 2 later, when Matt had begun to suffer so much from guilt-fueled depression that he didn't care, he didn't want to live. Mm. And whether Matt would have found that phrase then, I don't know. But fortunately for all concerned, he did.
That's the consequence of this is that United did continue. And had he not asked Jimmy that, let's say that Jimmy's still in 2 minds, he's not sure. Yeah. Let's put the gravity of that statement on, and let's attribute that with United continuing. Let's say that United postpone a couple of more games and Jimmy's growing more disinterested. Yeah. He's having to focus more on the dead than, as he understandably could have done. Yes. Let's say in this scenario, he doesn't convince Bobby Charlton to continue. Mm. And like you said, Matt, who was in 2 minds about coming back anyway, might well have not even been that indecisive if Jimmy hadn't carried on. Do you know what I mean? So it really, you know, if it got to that point where...
The best way of putting it, I mean, Jimmy didn't... He had pitifully thin resources after, well, obviously, because of what they'd lost. They signed 2 players. One turned out to be a wonderful short-term buy. The other one turned out to be a bit of a disruptive influence, Dan Crowther. But they, not through his own fault, but it's just his personality just went down like a lead balloon, quite frankly. And but what you haven't mentioned, and you could have done, I think why the achievement must be measured against the loneliness of Jimmy Murphy at that time. No, he didn't win the FA Cup. No, he didn't produce miraculous results in the league, both of which are totally understandable, given that his team had been ripped, and half his reserve team had been ripped away. But he was doing it without Bert Whalley and Tom Curry. So that the trainer and the coach, de facto coach, people who helped Busby and Murphy and duplicated and complemented their work, but top men, loved by the players. They were killed at Munich as well.
Yeah.
So Murphy was totally alone. You know, Matt was fighting for his life and couldn't do anything. And Jimmy Murphy was totally alone. And David Meek told me one thing. David Meek became the reporter for Manchester United for the Evening News because the Evening News man was killed at Munich.
Yeah.
And David Meek, you know, quite inexperienced, went there, and he said that he didn't realise until many years later. Jimmy Murphy had not only, and later Matt Busby, had not only lost Curry and Whalley, as well as all the players. The press were sort of part of Manchester United at that time. The boys who died at Munich, they travelled all over Europe. They had a sort of squad mentality. I'm sure that I've read a few of their articles, and a harsh critic might have described them as slightly pro-United. Yeah. They were really part of the club, and Matt and Jimmy had lost them as well.
Yeah.
So the loneliness and isolation in which Jimmy, in particular, initially Jimmy and later Matt, were working in those months, it makes the way they kept the flag flying quite as extraordinary as everything else.
You can't imagine the guilt that both... I mean, first of all, Sir Matt must have been feeling that...
Why do I live when all those wonderful boys with their lives in front of them died?
How close do you think he came to,
suicide?
Not suicide,
no,
but to not taking charge of United again.
Oh, well, all the evidence points to the great heroine of Manchester United being Jean Busby.
Yeah.
Because without her, whether Matt would have come round and got over his guilt and his grief, both of them, equally, in time, no one can know. All we do know is that the person who talked him round and who came out with the key argument, which was, Matt, there's only one way you can make it up to these boys, and that's by rebuilding the team. There's only one way you can make the supporters happy again. That's by rebuilding the team successfully. You owe it to everybody to come back. And eventually he came round to that, and he was feeling better. They got to the cup final. He said, I'm going to the cup final. And he did go to Wembley, although Jimmy Murphy was the manager. But Matt managed to struggle on crutches out to sit beside Jimmy on the bench. And it was tough for Matt. He cried. He still felt terrible. and but he did it, and it was Gene who convinced him of that. And so, we talk about Matt Busby and Jimmy Murphy, but maybe Gene Busby should have a statue as well.
Yeah, maybe. It seemed clear to me it seems clear from the research and everything like that the European Cup almost began to resemble the fulfilment of what their journey was going to be.
Yes.
I mean, the idea was, from Jimmy's point of view, that he would build another Youth Cup winning side, from which Matt could build a European Cup winning side.
Yes.
But in the earlier days, sort of 10 years earlier than that, or even 5 years earlier, before the disaster, when it was all consuming, and the idea was for this never-ending conveyor belt of success. It seems symbolic that it wasn't like that after Munich. It was like, if we just do this one time, then it's going to represent everything that we fought for.
Yes, also bear in mind that other clubs had seen what Manchester United had done, and although sometimes in football, the slow learners, they do, they pick up tricks from other people, and they saw how Manchester United had built. It was becoming more difficult. It was becoming more expensive.
Yeah.
And the key was that before, Matt always denied, there were fridges changing hands and holidays and in the sun and so on. But even if we take Matt at his word, there is no question that it was, by the 60s, it was taking more than a fridge. It was taking, for a really good young player, fees of £3,000, £4,000, £5,000 per changing. Parents were becoming and they were suddenly moving houses, moving into the suburbs, and there's no guarantee that any of these kids were going to come off.
Yeah.
And bear in mind that for Manchester United to do what they'd done before, they were going to have to find some more Bobby Charltons, some more Duncan Edwardses.
Yeah.
I mean, they come along once in a century, once in a half century, that quality. So it was very, very difficult, and eventually Matt realised that the Leopard was going to have to change his spots, and that building from within in this idealistic way wasn't enough, and that he was going to have to find a plan B, and that meant breaking the world transfer record for Dennis Law. That was the biggest sign of the change of tack.
And there was also, there were other signings which complemented that. Obviously, Pat Crerand came in.
Pat Crerand was signed to provide the ammunition for Dennis Law, which he did perfectly.
Yeah. But it was almost like I said, the changing of an era in that, United accepted that they would have to supplement homegrown talent with these. That was
the key difference. He changed, and instead of this sort of micromanaged youth-led football, which was the Busby Babes. If you're lucky enough to get hold of Pathé News little clips of some of their football, and you see the little 1 and 2 touch football involving Edwards and Eddie Coleman, another of the great technicians, and Charlton and so on. He needed a different strategy, and he needed a star-led team.
Yeah,
he knew George Best had come through. They knew George Best wasn't a risk, if only they'd known. But they knew that ability-wise, he wasn't a risk, and that he was a potentially world-class player. They knew that Charlton was potentially a world-class player. And they got the third when Matt, at the fourth attempt, I think it was, signed Dennis Law. But he had to break this man who was so mean that with United's money, that he went 4.5 years between signing centre forward Tommy Taylor and Harry Gregg in the Busby. 4.5 years without making a major signing. They had a couple of small signings, but before making a four-figure, over £1,000 signing. This man who was so parsimonious with Manchester United's money and so fundamentally of the belief that you build from within, is suddenly going out and paying £115,000 Turin.
The absence of Lowe from the final in '68 it skews the figures a little bit because it's sort of seven or eight youth players.
Because of Brian Kidd.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it looks more heavily on the balance of United went back to basics and did.
It does skew it. But the fact is that they got to the final largely through the exploits of 3-star players.
Yeah.
You know, in other words, if you took Law, Best and Chat, okay, you could take Law out of the final and they still won, albeit after extra time. But you take away those 3-star players, and Paddy Crerand will be growling at me here, but because he was 3.5-star players, but he was. They wouldn't have got that far. If you look at the cup final against Leicester City and you see that, which I still maintain it's the most underrated goal ever scored at Wembley, the Dennis Law goal where he lets the ball run between the two defenders and then slots it back between them, King and Appleton. But it was those 3 players were the key to it all. And yes, you can argue forever about Stepney and how he improved the team. No question about that. You can argue that Tony Dunn was one of the most underrated left backs that we've ever seen in this country, and I wouldn't argue with that. You can go through the influence of Nobby Stiles. You can talk about they wouldn't have won the final but for John Aston. So but really the key was the 3 stars. And you can talk about Kidd's great performance in the final, but it was those 3 stars, and it was. He'd maintained United's tradition of independence. Yeah. And bear in mind that 2 of the 3 stars were homegrown, but the signing of Law and Crerand, it was necessary. He couldn't in the era of the 60s, he couldn't do it in a way that had been first envisaged in the 30s. And
really, the remarkable thing to just step off track a minute is when you compare that to Ferguson's success in the 90s, is that when everyone now, and I guess maybe it's extended further again from Mourinho, and sorry, it'll be a laboured point, but I'll get there in the end. So Ferguson came as close as anyone could in the modern era to reasonably replicating what's known as the United identity. Yes. Now, the caveat with that is that this United identity can only ever be that 68 side, because you can never, unless you spend 7 or 8 years with the patience to replicate 58, and even then you've got to have Fortune on your side. Yeah.
And not Quentin either. Yeah. The other Fortune. Dame Fortune.
Yeah. Certainly not Quentin. Although he
wasn't bad, yes.
So the point is that like you said, the modern United, in terms of supplementing that homegrown talent with a couple of major stars, is very much the model that Busby built after Munich, which is again, the romantic vision of what the best United side, or the most true to its identity is the pre-Munich side. The closest that we'll ever get is...
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think that if you look at now, was Cristiano Ronaldo a homebred player? In a sense, but they paid 12 million for him. And that's in an era where 12 million was 12 million. Yeah. And yes, he came at the age of 18. Yes, he changed as a player at Manchester United, and very much for the better. But he wasn't homegrown in the sense of Stan Pearson or Charlie Mitten it can never be done like the Busby Babes again. I wish it could. I wish there was a way of doing so, but I can't see how that can happen again. I think what Alex Ferguson did, and we go back to this theme of reinterpretation of Busby's methods, was constantly to do that, constantly to... the class of 92 was probably the best, and will anybody in British football ever exceed that in terms of emulating a bit of the Busby Babes strategy, where the kids all grow up together with a love for the club. But no, it'll have to be done forever, I think, by Manchester United using their money to make astute signings. And I just hope that that in future that they come. They're sort of like Ronaldo's, the signings. They're players that you buy, you get the best of, and then they leave at the end of their careers. That would be the ideal now.
Yeah.
But you know, I still feel that familiarity. I don't think a quick turnover of players, or churn, as Ed Woodward once called it, is the right way to build Manchester United football. But maybe I'm old-fashioned.
I want to talk a little bit about the post-retirement period of Sir Matt and the sort of relationship with him and Jimmy after that retirement. When Sir Matt retired, he famously wrote in one newspaper column, I've lost my grip. Mm-hmm. You've got George Best's elevation to superstar status, which is probably the best reflection of that. So footballers were achieving this new level of fame, increasingly aggressive games at the time as well, with discipline issues. Do you think those two were the key elements which made him want to take a step back? Yeah, that and the rise of English coaches. I mean, English coaches are not so fashionable, and we're talking now in 2018. But still, at that time, the coaching scene in England was very, very vibrant. We touched earlier on Malcolm Allison at City, who was helping Joe Mercer to build a fantastic team just across Manchester. You had Don Revie, who'd been at Manchester City, had been a groundbreaking false nine, deep lying centre forward, whatever you call it, but was obviously a footballing thinker. Had gone to Leeds United and was only too happy to relieve United of John Giles when he fell out with Matt for the 18th time. But there were good coaches all over the Don Howe would have been coming through at that time. And frankly, Matt was being overtaken, and that United were losing games. Even though the team was aging, they were losing games to teams that maybe they should have beaten because those teams were better organised. And I think Matt realised that, and that was why his first attempt at a succession to himself was to stay in charge, but to have one of these modern coaches who happened to be at Manchester United in charge of the team. People have criticised Matt a lot for the appointment of Wilf McGuinness. And Wilf might have his own feelings, but Wilf was a very prominent coach. Yeah. He'd been on the bench with Alf Ramsey when England won the World Cup. Yeah. His career had been ruined by injury. And as so often happens, Rafa Benitez, loads of others, a guy whose career is ruined with injury, he's all the more determined to prove himself as a coach. And that was very much Wilf. So Wilf was one of the new breed of young coaches. And so the idea of putting him in charge with Matt there was not necessarily a bad one. Bear in mind, Liverpool were about to take over with the boot room, which was the same sort of idea. So it wasn't a bad idea. It was just that they did it so badly. And somebody told somebody who knew a lot about Manchester United at that time gave me an idea of what went wrong. The idea was, or an example of what went wrong. The idea was that Matt would stay in overall charge of the broad brush things, including media relations. Yeah. And so leaving Wilf to concentrate on the team, the first team, which was fine until a Friday, when the reporters would ring Wilf up and say, what are the injuries and what's the likely team for tomorrow, Wilf? And he'd say, well, you have to ask the boss. He does the media relations. So they'd say, fine, okay, no problem. They'd ring Matt,
And Matt would say, well, I don't really want to talk to you because Wilf's in charge of the first team.
Yeah.
So that created an atmosphere of chaos.
Yeah.
And the whole thing, which of course fed into the players. And you know what players do when there's any sign of weakness in the admin? It's their excuse, isn't it?
Yeah.
Oh, it's hopeless. The club's going to pieces. Blah blah blah. And it had a sort of snowball effect, and that was why Wilf he did well to get to, I think, 2 or 3 semi-finals.
Yeah,
he wasn't a disaster by any means, but it was a harrowing experience for him, and eventually lost his job.
And then the other thing was that these senior players who, fair enough, they're being coached by Wilf, but the senior players didn't respect him in the same way.
Well, they didn't respect him because they were better than him.
Yeah.
I mean, Wilf was a good player, but because of injury, he never reached
his own potential. Yeah,
he never reached his own potential, and even if he had, he might not have been quite as good as Paddy Crerand or Dennis Law, and yet he was having to tell these guys who were his seniors how to play at a time when they, as ageing players, were less receptive than they would ever be to instruction. Mm. So it was just a complete nightmare. And I think Matt, when he looked back at it, would have seen that. But of course, it's always, even Matt didn't have, all round 360-degree hindsight.
The other thing was as well that the players, whenever they would if they'd ask Wilf a question and they got an answer they didn't like, they'd go to Matt.
They'd go to who they still called the boss.
Yeah.
Even Wilf called him boss.
Yeah.
So, it was a nightmare. It was a hopeless situation. It defeated not only Wilf, it defeated Frank O'Farrell, and in the end Dave Sexton as well, all of whom came to Old Trafford with very good reputations. It needed somebody really tough and, when necessary, nasty to sort it out in Tommy Docherty, and even that didn't last.
Yeah. Just to touch on Jimmy's position in that, I mean, when Matt retired, there was a quote which was told to me from his family, and I never found it in any research I did myself, but they said that there would always be a high and honoured position for Jimmy at Manchester United.
Yeah, I've read that,
No, that obviously didn't quite ring true.
No.
So my own take on that is that Busby's decision to retire didn't mean he had a responsibility to Jimmy necessarily.
No.
But as I tried to explain in the book, I think the beginning of the marginalisation was due to Wilf's own reluctance because he obviously had Matt as a superior bit. Yeah. Even if Jimmy would have been in theory his assistant, he was still in deference to him. Yes. Obviously, you got the scenario where the senior players are approaching Matt, and Jimmy's influence was on his own merits was waning. Yeah. What was your interpretation of how all that happened? And how it unraveled?
I think the high and my interpretation of the high and honoured place was that was an emotional statement rather than an unwritten contract.
Yeah,
I don't think it smacks of Matt's fondness for the benign, bland statement. I don't think that it wasn't characteristic of him to make promises on behalf of the board.
Yeah.
I think he was making an emotional promise, that in the annals of Manchester United, I don't think he was in a position to make any other promise. So I think that one is a little bit unfair.
You think maybe Jimmy took it a little bit too literally at the time.
Those in the Jimmy camp, and there are many.
Yeah.
For two men who never publicly fell out.
Yeah.
Let's bear that in mind. And who worked together so harmoniously and created so much. And I don't disagree with the statue for Jimmy Murphy. I don't think that would be excessive in the slightest, although probably Jimmy Murphy might say it.
Yeah.
But for that, they've and you and I probably know it as well as anybody recently, that they've spawned huge supporters clubs among historians, among United historians, whether they're official ones or people who just are fascinated by United's history. People do tend to fall into two camps, and I'm going to probably destroy my own argument now by saying I can see both sides. I really can.
Yeah.
I think, Matt, also the thing you must bear in mind that towards the end of Jimmy's life, when he did become a little embittered, I wouldn't want to exaggerate that because that's not the type person he was, but that he was asking, in a way, his camp were asking people Matt to deliver things that he really couldn't by then. That Matt's power was waning by then, and that he couldn't sort of say, listen, give Jimmy a chauffeur-driven car in to work every day. Bear in mind, Manchester United always had a tradition of not wasting money. And I don't think it's not as if Jimmy was driven to poverty. I don't know. If I say that, it'll make it sound as if I'm in the Busby camp against Jimmy, and I'm not. I think they're indivisible, you know.
Yeah.
But all I can say is that I don't think Matt was in a position to deliver all the things that people now retrospectively think he should have done for Jim.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fair. My conclusion of the retirement was that, well, as I wrote about in the book, I felt that those 10 years after Munich to Wembley were very much an emotional journey for both of them.
Yes.
And while Wembley represented the end for Sir Matt, I think that Jimmy felt he probably had a little bit, a few more years left in him.
Yes.
And that had been taken away from him. Yeah. Perhaps, but again, like you said,
I do feel that I think that charge sticks. Neither of us know whether there was a conversation between Jimmy and Matt in the weeks leading up to Wilf's appointment and Matt's elevation, if you like, to general manager. But all of my research points to the fact that there really wasn't much. Yeah. And there was no succession plan in that it guaranteed Jimmy a continued even office, because he had to move offices, Yeah. So it was unfortunate, but you also have to, and again, I'm not being an apologist for Matt, but football wasn't. You see, the Manchester United of today, I get the impression, for all the faults, would have handled that situation more smoothly.
You would think.
Yeah, and more caringly, if you like.
Unlike the Louis van Gaal.
Well, Louis van Gaal, if he heard this, would be spluttering with rage and very understandably.
I know, yeah.
Very understandably. But, no, I just...
Generally speaking.
I got the... You see, look, only 11 years earlier had been Munich. And the players who survived Munich, but whose careers didn't. Okay, Albert Scanlon played on, but never quite to the same level. Dennis Viollet did. No, I think Dennis Viollet did survive Munich. Who knows what would have happened? But he remained a top player for a few years afterwards. But Jackie Blanchflower didn't. Yeah. Jackie Blanchflower was a player who could play today. He was he could do anything. He could play in any position. He was a beautiful technician. He played in goal in the cup final. I mean, he never survived. Johnny Berry was reaching the veteran stage, but he ended up, within a matter of months out of the clubhouse and working in a factory in Trafford Park. Now, Can you imagine? I mean, God forbid if some awful accident happened now, but can you imagine Scott McTominay heaving sacks in Trafford Park in 6 weeks after 6 months after the accident?
Yeah,
I couldn't. It would be, even if, and the club would certainly not allow that, but even if they did, public opinion would rise up in fury. So it was, in a way, life was tougher then,
Yeah.
Almost cruel. And so you've got to bear in mind that Matt was a man of his time. And that, Alex Ferguson was at United in many ways, a more humane time.
Yeah, absolutely. In your book, you reveal that Busby wanted Jock Stein to come in after Wilf.
Yeah.
And he went as far as having a secret meeting with him.
Yeah.
How and why did that not happen?
Well, the most plausible theory for that, Jock gave the reason that his wife preferred to live in Scotland, and that was certainly true. They were very happy with their life there, and Jock was very cognizant of that. But he did later go to Leeds, didn't he? So, albeit for only about 10 minutes. But no, a much more plausible reason, and the one I believe, is that it fell down simply on the grounds that Matt had made promises to the backroom staff at Manchester United. And Jock said, well, listen, if I come, he comes, he comes, he's coming, and he's coming.
Yeah.
And Matt didn't want, the last thing Matt wanted to do was to go to the backroom staff that had been reconstructed painstakingly over 12 years since Munich, and many of them former players, and say to them, boys, you're out of work. So I just think it was one of those things that it didn't work out.
The person who did come in was Frank O'Farrell.
Yeah.
He's far less complimentary about Sir Matt than what Wilf is.
Yes.
Do you think, I mean, at this point, I know you said that Busby's influence was on the wane, but it obviously caused an insurmountable problem for O'Farrell.
Well, O'Farrell, they got off on the wrong foot because at O'Farrell's interview, which was with Matt and Louis Edwards, chairman, and Matt said, the wages are, whatever it was, 12,000 a year. And Louis, bless him, butted in and said, no, it's 15. And O'Farrell looked at Matt and thought, I haven't even joined the club yet, and you're trying to diddle me out of $3,000. And so he actually did say in a book later, Frank, that I knew then I couldn't trust him. So that was a bad start. But then the players, were playing up. The senior players were playing up. Frank never had a fair chance, and I think there's a lot of sadness.
Yeah.
Particularly, as you know, Matt's family were very good Catholics, and Frank was a good Catholic, and I remember being told that Sheena, Matt's late daughter, being particularly upset when Frank O'Farrell lost his job, but that was the way it was. Again, the impossible situation. You could say, well, Wilf was David Moyes and Frank was Louis van Gaal. They came in an impossible situation. What the part of Jose Mourinho is, the part of Tommy Docherty is played by Jose Mourinho.
I've often thought that, because, I mean, Docherty resents it, but I think they're similar characters, aren't they? But Docherty's a great example, I mean, because he almost embraced Busby in a way.
Yes, he did. No question.
He didn't shut him out or anything.
Nope.
Up until the sacking, he never even... I mean, there was the episode where Docherty always suspected that Busby had vetoed the signing of Shilton, which would have made a massive difference to United at that point.
Yeah.
But really, it wasn't until Docherty was sacked that he felt that Busby had it in for him. So despite Doherty being on the face of it something that Busby would oppose in terms of his brashness and his outspokenness. Particularly, there was the episode with Doherty where he sent when he was in charge of Chelsea, wasn't it? And he sent all the disciplinary issue where he sent all the team home or something. Did Busby like him as a United manager? Did he think that he was...
He liked the football, yes, I think he did. But the worry always with Tom was, it was at a time of, the old brown envelopes and all that kind of stuff. And there was always, rightly or wrongly, a suspicion that Tommy sort of had got slightly involved in that. And whether it was true or not, I don't know. But I do know that Laurie McMenemy, if we move on to the next manager of '01, when Laurie McMenemy was interviewed for the job that Ron Atkinson got, that Laurie McMenemy was given a rather generous packet of expenses for coming to a function at Manchester United. And he took it back to his room and he had a look at it. And he formed the impression, looked at his wife and he said, "This is a test." And he went back and he returned it to Matt, who had given him the money, and said, "Thanks very much, but I think that's a bit too much for blah, blah, blah," whatever it was. Matt took it back and that was it. And so... maybe although Laurie McMenemy would have passed that test, as being a man who wouldn't take an excessive backhander, but Manchester United failed that test, and McMenemy didn't come because he just felt, nah, I don't think so.
At that point, you had Sexton, whose style conflicted with supporters. Atkinson, who
called Trafford.
Atkinson, who brought success in style, but not the success that United fans wanted.
Not quite on the field, no. He wasn't bad. He's still very much loved by United fans. I've seen him at a couple of United functions over the last 2 years, and he's always given a good reception because he understood the need for swaggering, a swagger on the pitch. But they didn't win the league, no.
The interesting concept with this is that Busby really is the person who's responsible for the need for United manager to bring success as well as entertaining football. He said as much. I think it was. I'm not sure if it was after he first retired or after Wilf after he was sacked, where he said that the man who was responsible for coming in, the man who was going to be United manager, was responsible for bringing success as well as entertaining football. Mm-hmm. Now, United is almost like success is the primary goal and entertaining football is the bonus. Yeah. The question is, should it be the other way around? Is that how Busby would have wanted it? Or
Busby would have wanted both. Look, again, you're going to throttle me here, but... Manchester City won the league, playing beautiful football. I think Busby would have liked Pep Guardiola's team, and it would have approved that you could be successul. You can win a couple of trophies a season playing like that. Okay, it didn't happen immediately. Guardiola had to learn the hard way, but. No, I think you can do it. It's and there's no question for me that in fact it's almost an unrealistic question you ask because you know the answer to it. You know that Manchester United, being the scale and the tradition they are, have to win in style. If you look at Real Madrid and Barcelona, they expect to win things. Yeah, and they definitely wouldn't settle for a boring style of football. Manchester United are the same. The only difference at the moment, and it's very frustrating for Manchester United fans, and it would frustrate Matt and Jimmy now, is that the competition's so damned hard. Yeah. At least in Matt and Jimmy's day, it was a sort of level... it was a level playing field. They couldn't bash... Liverpool and Wolves into submission financially. They could try and be a little cleverer and pinch a penny here and there and do that sort of thing. But they never had the kind of... There was nobody like you had the wealth of Abu Dhabi, or in previous times the wealth of the Russian oligarchy, or American wealth. You know that, like Arsenal. Okay, they don't use it, but they could.
Yeah.
So the competition has got so much more clout than used to be the case.
One of the questions I'm asked most often these days is, since the release of the book, is how would Jimmy have coached today, or how would he have thought of the way that United play under Van Gaal or Mourinho? I don't think that's obviously to do with how far United are straying from their identity.
Yeah, that's right.
How do you think Sam would have viewed it?
Yeah, I think they both would have viewed it the same way. They like momentum. They don't like this sort of painting by numbers style of football. If you had to make a criticism of United since Ferguson, it would be that it's been almost the football of a different club. You know, I'm just trying to identify it with another club, but it's more like sort of modern Dutch football, if you like, or it doesn't have the improvisational feel that Manchester United had under the eras of both Busby and Ferguson. Obviously, it's difficult. What has to be said is that Alex Ferguson chose his timing for a variety of reasons, but a feeling that we'd seen the best of the squad he'd created was definitely what must have been one of them. And there have been huge difficulties because there have been three managers since. There have been huge difficulties in recruiting the requisite quality of player. But it hasn't worked. And consequently, Van Gaal, I don't think David Moyes really had a proper chance. I think he was badly treated by the players.
Yeah.
And by I think once you lose the players, you've had it. So in a way, you can't blame the club. But I think it was really badly treated by Manchester United. And in fact, you could almost draw a comparison there between the way the players treated Matt's successors and the way the players treated Sir Alex's successors, which was history repeating itself in the worst way. However, I digress. I think the style of football, has been rather wooden, and that's been common to the Van Gaal and the Mourinho eras. Although they profess to be different kinds of coaches, there are times when you just wouldn't see it. But on the plus side, there are still good players there. They're still being produced by Manchester United. I mean, Marcus Rashford. If I was a Manchester United supporter, I'd be very, very excited by the emergence of Marcus Rashford, who I think is going to be a really top player, because his attitude to the game is a little bit... I don't know him as a lad, but his attitude to the game reminds me very much of Ryan Giggs, or, the great the players that have come through the United system, in that he's focusing entirely on the game. I think the same applies to Scott McTominay. He's got great eyes, he's got a great concentration on the game, which is a lot of the battle if you're trying to make it at a top club. I really have a huge respect for McTominay. I think he could become as important to Manchester United as Darren Fletcher was. Yeah. And, only a fool would say, well, how important was that, everybody who played with him knew how important he was.
Yeah.
So there are good things, and there are good things that are Manchester United type things, but the football isn't. Just isn't. And I hope that changes next season. But it won't change without the players to do it. I think, I may be wrong, but I don't think Martial, Pogba, I don't think they don't look like Manchester United players to me. They look like, particularly Pogba, just looks like he's playing for himself. He looks like he's an individual performer, and you can't have that.
Well, we're talking about in parallels and things like that. Sorry to stray from the point, but there's a critical point in Doherty era when United were just about to be relegated, and they were playing poorly, and really they were playing restricted football for most of that season.
They were, actually, that's true. Yeah,
and Doherty did, to take a phrase from Jose Mourinho's playbook, he let the horses run freely, so to speak, and United went down, but they went down fighting, and then they came back up playing a more cavalier style. And obviously, when people think of Doherty's United, they think of the free-flowing Coppell and Hill, as opposed to the first 2 years. And that, obviously, Doherty is a stubborn man, but he had that internal resolve to change.
Yeah.
Do you think that Mourinho's capable of doing something a little bit?
Well, he did it at Real Madrid, but I'm surprised he hasn't done it sooner at Manchester United. At Real Madrid, he bought into the club's traditions, and he knew he couldn't play Porto or even Chelsea football at Real Madrid because it has to be done with far more of a flourish. And I think I honestly believe that he would do the same at Man United. He'd say, I know where I'm coming. I know the tradition of Manchester United. You know, Alex Ferguson's one of my heroes and friends, and I don't need anybody to tell me what you need to do at Manchester United. But he hasn't done it. It hasn't happened here. And I'm very, very surprised. And I think that will be his salvation if he can get players in who are good enough. Now, if you have Paul Pogba and you tell him to go and play with freedom, disaster. If you get Gareth Bale and you tell him to play with freedom, now you're talking. I think that's the difference. I think you've got to get absolute, maybe with Ronaldo and Messi, and who knows, maybe Salah and De Bruyne, the real Eden Hazard, the real top. Well, but Gareth Bale's, near or thereabouts. But for me, Pogba's not yet. Yeah, I think he has to play for the team and stop behaving, like an individual sport player, like a boxer.
Like the biggest thing that you could say from Ronaldo is that self-discipline. Yeah,
I think a lot of the things that are now levelled at Pogba. Obviously, Pogba is much more mature. He's 5 years older than Ronaldo was, 6 years older than Ronaldo was when he first came to the club. But I think the thing about Ronaldo is he always, once he learned what Sir Alex Ferguson required of him, he never looked back. He's never had a bad month, let alone a bad season since then. Can Pogba reach the same standard? To me, I think it's asking a lot.
I asked about, how Jimmy and Samat would have viewed today.
Well, they would have hated the football.
But in terms of away from United and the globalisation of the game, do you think that they would have loved how it's evolved? Because, it's something that they championed.
Well, they would have liked Guardiola's Barcelona. They would have, of course they would. They would have liked, oh dear, they would have liked Jurgen Klopp's attitude to the game. Because
I know we said there's no swearing, but it should come with an advisory before.
But it'd be interesting to see if he edits that bit. But no, I think he would like, secretly Man United fans would like the way Klopp's teams, Liverpool teams, play with passion, momentum and attack. And, yes, they get criticised for giving away, or until recently, the Klopp's Liverpool were criticised for giving away too many soft goals in games that maybe weren't the best. But, I think most United fans would settle for that as long as they were going toe to toe with City, like Liverpool have done in every game this season. Even the one they lost, they went head to head, toe to toe with them, and did well. So I think that's what United fans are yearning for. So yes, it can be done. Yes, Matt and Jimmy in their celestial season ticket seat on the front row of the director's box would be looking at teams like that and saying, yeah, it's the game we know, and it's the game they'd whisper, it's the game we'd like to see back here.
The final question is regarding one of the most often things I get asked again is how feasible is it that what Busby and Murphy did back then could be replicated in today's game? My answer to that is normally that no one would have 7 years for the patience for that fruit to bear. But
my answer is the same as yours.
But perhaps,
I'm sorry, it's just not going to happen.
Perhaps at let's say Fulham or at Burnley, do you know, where they've got the patience where maybe not at Burnley because they've now got a Premier League status where they're kind of dependent on that. I mean,
as we're talking, Burnley have just qualified for Europe with a 5-0 thrashing at Arsenal. You know what I mean? Just about. If that doesn't illustrate, our two nation league, I don't know what does. But people have ridiculously short memories. I mean, I hope this is not true, but it wouldn't surprise me if next season people are saying, yeah, Deitch has got us to 7th place again, but he hasn't really progressed us. I mean, it's the lack of sense of proportion in football it makes it impossible that anybody would say, yeah, we'll spend 7 years building a team. It just doesn't happen, and that's, people thought it was a freak when Alex Ferguson was given 6.5 years to win the league, although he did win other trophies to buy himself time, but. People thought that was a freak, and that was 2 generations ago in footballing terms.
The closest you may get is a Crewe Alexander. I mean, MK Dons.
Yeah, you could do it, but Ajax. But I mean, you're having to do it on or any team in Portugal because of the turnover. But you're having to do it on a small scale. You build a team, you hope to get 2 years out of it. Whereas the Busby Babes, they'd come to fruition in, let's say, full fruition in about 1955.
Yeah, 56.
55, 56. And they would have certainly carried on to 1965.
Yeah.
Easily.
Without exaggeration.
Without exaggeration or many team changes.
Yeah.
So, or many inward transfers, probably. If he'd chosen not to, but that is that can never happen again, and that's why it has to be celebrated.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Appreciate that.